In 1993, West Memphis, Arkansas was a quiet town where the biggest worry was whether the kids would make it home for dinner on time. That peace shattered when the bodies of 3 8-year-old boys were found in a wooded area called Robin Hood Hills. This wasn't a random act of violence. It was calculated, deliberate, and horrific. The investigation did not waste time. All roads seemed to lead to Damien Echols, Jason Baldwin, and Jessie Misskelley, a trio who stood out for all the wrong reasons in a town caught up in the grip of satanic panic. Evidence mounted, fibers tying them to the crime scene, witness accounts of Damien bragging, and Jessie's confession that laid it all bare. Tonight, we're diving into the case that ripped a community apart and left no room for doubt. Were these 3 teenagers dangerous killers hiding behind a facade of teenage rebellion, or did the town's fear create monsters out of misfits? We'll take a closer look. But before we get into that story, if you like your true crime brief and bingeable, you found the right podcast. I give you at least 2 episodes per week, so hit the follow button now, and welcome to 10-Minute Murder. In 1993, West Memphis, Arkansas was the kind of place where people left their doors unlocked, and the kids rode their bikes until the street light came on. That peace shattered when the bodies of 3 8-year-old boys, Stevie Branch, Christopher Byers, and Michael Moore, were discovered in a wooded area called Robin Hood Hills. Their deaths weren't just horrific. They were staged in a way that left no question about the perpetrator's intent. This wasn't random violence. It was calculated and methodical. The investigation did not meander. It zeroed in quickly on Damien Echols, Jason Baldwin, and Jessie Misskelley, 3 local teens who stood out like flashing red warning signs. Damien, with his penchant for black clothing, dark poetry, and all things occult, was a walking stereotype of trouble during the height of satanic panic. Jason Baldwin, his loyal friend, followed his lead, while Jessie Misskelley, a teenager with low IQ, often tagged along. Together, they were the perfect suspects in a crime that reeked of premeditation and ritual. This wasn't a case of the police grabbing at straws. The evidence began to stack up. Fibers that connected them to the crime scene, witness testimonies about Damien bragging, and most damning of all, Jessie's confession. Sure, Jessie's story wasn't airtight, but his detailed account of how the boys were lured and killed painted a picture that was hard to ignore. These weren't just 3 kids with bad reputations. They were dangerous individuals who had committed an act so monstrous that it shook an entire town to its core. For the prosecution, this wasn't just a case, it was a mandate. These boys weren't misunderstood teens rebelling against authority. They were calculated killers who needed to be held accountable. The jury agreed, as did the community. To the victims' families, justice wasn't just served, it was necessary. The West Memphis Three had stolen the lives of Stevie, Christopher, and Michael, and in doing so, they'd forfeited their own. As the years went on, a handful of critics tried to pick apart the case. They suggested that the 3 were scapegoats, victims of a town blinded by fear. But for many who followed the trial, the facts remained clear. This wasn't about hysteria or rushed judgment. This was about holding the guilty accountable. Justice doesn't always look clean, but in this case, it looked right. May 6, 1993 marked the day West Memphis, Arkansas lost its innocence. 3 second-grade boys, Stevie, Christopher, and Michael, had been reported missing the evening before. They'd gone out on their bikes after school, like any other day, and vanished. The search ended the next day in Robin Hood Hills, a wooded area that would forever be associated with one of the most gruesome crime scenes in the town's history. What searchers found was beyond horrific. The boys' bodies were submerged in a drainage ditch, stripped of their clothing and bound with their own shoelaces. Christopher had endured wounds so severe that investigators immediately suspected ritualistic mutilation. This wasn't just a crime, it was a calculated act of depravity. For a small town already swept up in the satanic panic, it felt like the ultimate nightmare brought to life. This wasn't the kind of case that left room for ambiguity. The staging of the scene, the binding, the violence, was purposeful. It spoke of the control and intent. the kind of cruelty that couldn't be dismissed as random. The whispers of satanic rituals weren't just fueled by cultural hysteria, they were born from the crime scene itself. For the families of Stevie, Christopher, and Michael, grief wasn't even the half of it. Losing a child is every parent's worst fear, but to lose them like this, in a way that felt almost otherworldly in its cruelty, pushed that fear into unspeakable territory. The community rallied, offering prayers, casseroles, and plenty of theories about who could have done something so heinous. Underneath it all, a cold truth lingered. If such evil could happen here, nowhere was safe. The need for justice burned through West Memphis like a fever. Fueled by fear and heartbreak, the investigation quickly honed on 3 suspects: Damien Echols, Jason Baldwin, and Jessie Misskelley. They didn't just fit the profile, they were the profile. In a town desperate for answers, the wheels of justice were already turning. And for many, it wasn't about whether they were guilty, it was about making sure this evil never struck again. The investigation into the murders of the 3 young boys gained momentum quickly, and all roads pointed to Damien Echols. Damien wasn't just the odd kid in West Memphis. He was a walking checklist of everything parents and police feared. He wore black, loved dark poetry, and he had an open fascination with the occult. In a town still caught up in the grip of satanic panic, as I mentioned, Damien's entire persona might as well have come with a neon sign flashing guilty. To law enforcement, he wasn't just a teenager who stood out. He was exactly the kind of person capable of orchestrating something as calculated and brutal as a ritualistic killing. He definitely had the knowledge of how to do so. 2 more names followed: Jason Baldwin, Damien's close friend, and Jessie Misskelley, a teenager with a low IQ who often tagged along with the pair. The 3 weren't just misfits, they were a trio bound by shared interests that painted a dark picture of their intentions. They quickly became the focus of a case that, for investigators, seemed to be writing itself. The first major breakthrough came when Jessie Misskelley confessed during an interrogation. Critics may question the tactics used, but Jessie's detailed account of how he, Damien, and Jason lured the boys to Robin Hood Hills and murdered them was as graphic as it was damning. Sure, some of the finer details didn't perfectly align with the evidence, but the overall story was consistent with what investigators believed happened. For police, this was the smoking gun they needed. Then there were the witnesses, the people who claimed Damien had openly bragged about the murders. While some of these accounts were shaky, they painted a clear picture of a teenager who wasn't just capable of the crime, but reveling in it. The forensic evidence added another layer. Fibers found at the crime scene reportedly matched items from Damien and Jason's homes. While not bulletproof, the evidence was enough to solidify the case. Damien's own behavior didn't help his situation. During the investigation, he was described as calm, detached, and even amused. For law enforcement, this wasn't just a teenager with a bad attitude. It was the behavior of a killer who felt untouchable. To the police, Damien wasn't just a suspect. He was the embodiment of everything they believed had darkened their town. By the time the case was ready for trial, investigators felt confident. They had a confession, eyewitness testimonies, and forensic evidence. For the police and prosecutors, this was more than just solving a crime. It was about sending a message. The murders of 3 young boys weren't going unanswered, and the West Memphis Three weren't getting away with it. The trial of the West Memphis Three wasn't just a courtroom drama. It was a reckoning. At its heart was Jason Misskelley's confession, the backbone of the state's case. Jessie described in chilling detail how he, Damien, and Jason lured Stevie, Christopher, and Michael into the woods and ended their lives. The inconsistencies were written off as the kind of gaps you'd expect from a nervous teen recounting a horrific crime, not enough to outweigh the grim truth of what he revealed. The prosecution bolstered their case with witness testimonies. Several people claimed Damien had bragged about the murders, calling them a thrill. Was Damien the kind of person who might embellish a story to shock someone? Sure. But was he also the kind of person who might act on his darkest impulses? Absolutely. Then there was Damien himself, who practically acted like the prosecution's star witness against himself. His courtroom demeanor was described as smug and detached, like he was a bored observer. It wasn't hard for the jury to connect the dots. That wasn't an innocent teenager being railroaded by circumstance. It was someone who felt untouchable, a chilling reflection of the crime itself. When the verdicts came down, they felt as inevitable as they were justified. Damien Echols was sentenced to death, Jason Baldwin to life without parole, and Jessie Misskelley to life plus 40 years. The courtroom didn't erupt into cheers, but there was a palpable sense of relief. For the victims' families, this was the justice they'd been waiting for, the closure they desperately needed. The West Memphis Three weren't just convicted criminals. They were living proof of what happens when darkness takes root in a small town. Some argued that the satanic panic of the time played too big a role in the investigation. But let's not get distracted by that. The evidence, however unpolished, painted a clear picture. Jessie's confession, Damien's behavior, and the fibers tying them to the crime scene were enough to convict. For a time, the case felt closed. The families of the victims had justice, and the people of West Memphis could sleep a little easier, knowing the killers weren't walking free. Critics may argue over the details, but at its core, the trial wasn't about nuance. It was about righting a terrible wrong. Decades later, some still question the guilt of the West Memphis Three, but those questions often ignore the weight of the evidence and the brutal reality of the crime. This wasn't just a story of three outcast teenagers. It was the story of three young boys whose lives were cut short in the most horrifying way imaginable. And for the people of West Memphis, that's what mattered most. That's 10-Minute Murder for today. Brief and bingeable true crime. I'm Joe, I'm the host, and thank you for taking the time to listen. And allow me a moment to explain what I'm doing here with this West Memphis Three case. I do not know whether they're guilty or innocent. Don't have a clue. I've followed this story since I was a literal child. I know the information inside and out. I do not know whether they are innocent or guilty, and many of you listening to me right now, you don't know either. I know that they're out right now. They're not in jail for murder. They are technically murderers. They're out on an offered plea. And by the way, if you don't know what an offered plea is, I'm going to release a future episode detailing the offered plea and where it came from, where the case that it all started from. I'll do that in a future episode. But they are out on an offered plea. They are technically guilty of murder. But are they murderers? We don't know. So the way I decided to do this, since I don't know, and you may or may not agree with this, but I decided to do two different episodes, one of which you just heard, where I lean toward guilty. The other one, you can listen to it as well if you'd like to. It leans toward innocent. So that's the way I decided to do this. It was a case that I didn't feel like I could just continue to ignore, so this is the way I've decided to do it. And I really appreciate you listening to it. You can go to my website, 10minutemurder.com, catch up with everything that's happening with the podcast, and send me an email, joe@10minutemurder.com. And that's going to do it. That's your episode for today. Thank you so much for listening to 10 Minute Murder.